much, Mr President. I introduced the Land Acquisition Public Purpose Bill 2017 in response to the recent actions of the government in issuing declarations of intent to acquire land from Australian farmers in both the Rockhampton and Charters Towers regions of Queensland. The federal government's statement, as contained in correspondence to landholders, was that the land acquired would be owned by the Department of Defence, allow for expanded training exercises by the Australian Army, as well as facilitating an increase in use by the Singaporean Army from 6,000 troops for periods of 6 weeks to 14,000 troops for up to 18 weeks. The Army had only sent out the correspondence in regard to these acquisitions following an inspection by the Singaporean Army. The Singaporean Army had stated that it wanted the land for its future training purposes, as indicated in the department's correspondence about the land in question. At public meetings held with the landowners by the Army, it was clearly stated that the primary purpose of the land acquisition was that the land was being acquired not for the purposes of the Australian Army, but for the use and training of the Singaporean Army. The government referred in their correspondence to the Australian-Singaporean Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, which included as a general arrangement pursuant to the Singaporean-Australia Free Trade Agreement, SAFTA. The SAFTA agreement refers only to cooperation between the two countries in a number of areas, including the military, as well as technology and agriculture cooperation areas of interest. It does not place an obligation on Australia or Singapore. The Army has a land area in the Shoal Water Bay Training Complex of approximately 1 million acres, yet the Australian Army stated this was not sufficient. There was no consideration of the interests held by the Australian landowners, where exactly was the public purpose as required by the legislation. Just like to expand on this. The Australian Army has quite extensive land in the Shoal Water Bay area, and yet they were wanting to allow the Singaporean Army to buy up more land around that area from prime agricultural land from farmers. Now, the Australian land, what has happened over the years, they said, we can't use this land. Why? Because of the overgrowth, because the number of trees on it, and over the period of time they have not been able to clear the land due to the environmental laws by the Queensland government. So here we have, oh well, we can't use this land, so we'll just let that sit there, but we'll go and acquire some great agricultural land that is producing thousands of head of cattle that they send to the markets, so that we're providing jobs in abattoirs and the ongoing businesses in the whole area, but we're ready to say, oh no, we've just need to acquire some more land. As if prime agricultural land you can pick up anywhere in Australia is not the case. It is so valuable and it's so necessary to keep it as that. So, public purpose, that's the whole intent of this bill. Where was the public purpose as required by the legislation? There was absolutely no public support for this acquisition, nor was there any purpose behind it that benefited the Australian public. So my discussions with people, which I went up to Charters Towers, and we're talking about anywhere between 50 to 60 farming families that were looking down the barrel of a gun to lose their properties. No one was listening to them. These are properties that were handed on, from a couple of generations, or properties that people had bought and worked extremely hard to improve, and it's where they want to live with their children and actually hand on the properties to their children. But this was all so that Singaporean Army personnel could come out here and train for a few weeks a year. And we're talking about land that's bigger than the size of Singapore itself that they're wanting to buy up. So the Army had stated the public would benefit from this acquisition. Well, I beg to differ from that. No benefit could be demonstrated, but significant detriment could clearly be demonstrated not only to the landholders directly affected, but to the entire regions of Rockhampton and Charters Towers. So the benefit, they were saying, because the Singaporeans were going to come there, they were actually going to increase the tourism in the area. The tourism was actually going to destroy a small country town called Marlborough. It's not a tourist area, but it would have affected the businesses there because they wouldn't have the trade from the farming families there that would go into town, use the post office, go to the local pub, because the Singaporeans were actually going to go to Townsville because they were buying up the accommodation there. They had plans where they were going to go for their time off. The loss to Australia was approximately around about 800 acres of prime grazing country, and the loss of over 90,000 head of cattle going to local abattoirs and their inevitable closure and loss of employment to both regions. As I had said, the loss of over $90 million in cattle sales and twice that figure after processing of the cattle from sales by the abattoirs. We have seen our state of Queensland go through dire straits with droughts, whereas farmers can't even keep the cattle on their property. And yet here we are taking another 90,000 head to, even I heard as many as 100,000 head out of the marketplace. So on top of the drought, we're actually putting ourselves in dire straits where we won't even be able to produce, have enough cattle in Australia for our own needs, let alone export needs. And yet the government didn't, or anyone, had no concerns about the impact this is going to have on Australia. And at the briefings to the affected landholders, the Army representative stated the local community would be providing food, hospitality and transport, to name a few. However, it was then found that the Singapore government had already sought expressions of interest from offshore companies for the transportation of both food and ordnances into the area. Food and ordnances supplied directly from Singapore and not from one Australian company. We were told that the Singaporeans were going to bring in $2.5 billion into the country, and we're going to make so much money out of this and it's going to be great for the country. No, it wasn't. It was the worst deal that was actually going to happen. And as I said, they had lined up Australian shipping companies to bring in their food and ordnances from overseas. This was not a good deal for us. The government stated it was supporting rural communities, but here it was destroying two communities, offering no compensation to other businesses other than the landowners who didn't want to sell. I doubt there was only a couple of people that did sell, because they were issued enormous amounts of money for their properties, and hopefully that one fell over, then the others would. But the majority of farmers that I spoke to, they didn't want to sell their properties. They were being forced into it. Additionally, in the Charters Towers region, Infrastructure Australia and the Prime Minister of Australia had listed the Hells Gate Dam project as a high priority project, which he did. It was in his election promise, and I spoke to him the first meeting that I had about going ahead with Hells Gate Dam. Yet, the very land that could benefit from that dam was the very land the Army had stated it was interested in acquiring. So what was going to happen? Are we going to build the Hells Gate Dam and then just hand over the property to the Singaporean Army? Doesn't make common sense to me. When raised at a briefing by me, the Army representative stated he was unaware of this priority infrastructure, as did the Department Representative. So is the right hand talking to the left hand, or no one knows what the hell's going on? And yet the farmers up there are so distraught that they didn't know what was happening with them. It was a clear case of a compulsory acquisition not having a direct public purpose as required by the Act, but instead appearing to benefit a third party. So I ask the question, where was the public purpose? The Australian Army had only sent out correspondence in regard to this acquisition following an inspection by the Singapore Army and its statement specified that it wanted the land as indicated in the correspondence as the land of interest. So it's up to the Singaporean army. They went out and they said, no, this is what we want. And the term public purpose is more than the vague legal definition of the Act, referring, as it does, to those legislative areas for which the Parliament has power to make laws. The key element in the land acquisition proposal by the Australian Defence Forces was the definition of public purpose. An information guide published by the Department of Finance and Deregulation in May 2011, titled "The Commonwealth and You: Compulsory Acquisition of Land," stated, "The Minister issues a document to affected landowners which states that the Minister is considering the acquisition by the Commonwealth land for a public purpose. This document is a pre-acquisition declaration. It tells you which Commonwealth authority wants to acquire the land. It describes the land fully. It states that the Minister thinks the land appears to be suitable for a public purpose, and it states the public purpose the land has been chosen for, and it explains why the Minister considers the land suitable for the intended use. But there is no clarity on the meaning of those words, public purpose. In general, Australians do understand, because the country is growing, we need infrastructure, and they understand that they may not like it, but they understand that if their land has to be acquired for maybe putting in a dam, or maybe a roadworks or a motorway or a hospital, or for some reason that it is of general benefit to the public, they understand. Like I said, they don't like it, but they will actually accept it if they're paid the right compensation for it. But I understand, and this is why the farming families had my total support when it came to this. They were going to lose their properties for what? So Singaporeans can come out here 6 weeks or 18 months, 18 weeks, a year, and actually train when we have that much land in Australia, when there's other training areas. Basically, they should have been going to Western Australia, even up to the Northern Territory, but no, they want prime agricultural land in Australia, and they had their hands tied. They were having meetings with the Defence Force, they were having meetings with other people. No one was listening to them. And it was well attended by the public, by people in the area at public meetings. The second reading speech on the introduction of the Land Acquisition Act in 1989 adds little to the meaning of the words, other than referring to Section 31 of the Act. However, the following sentence is relevant, as it gives the tenor of the purpose of the words within the meaning of the Act. This government is concerned by the need to strike a balance between the rights of private property on the one hand and the legitimate needs of society for land for public purposes on the other. This sentence within the second reading speech clearly delineates that the acquisition is for the benefit of society. There was no substantive debate on what the phrase public purpose meant. The reason why one has to revert to external explanations is due to the vagueness of the definition within Section 6 of the Act, which states as follows. Public purpose means a purpose in respect of which Parliament has power to make laws, and includes, in relation to land in a territory, any purpose in relation to the territory. In judgments on which the issue has been raised, the acquisition must be for the primary benefit of the community and Australia generally. Well, that certainly wasn't the case when it came to destroying our prime agricultural farming land, displacing Australians for Singaporean army to train out here, and I beg to ask the question, what deals were done? We cannot allow this to happen. I feel for the Australian people. I know what it's like to work hard to own your own land, to love the land that you're on, and then to have someone come and say, oh no, you've got to give it up because we want Singaporeans to train here with no benefit to this country whatsoever. and especially when, as I stated, there is other land they could train on in this country. And it's about time that members in this place and the other place started listening to the Australian people and their pains, what they're going through, and not listening to the bureaucrats and those others that have no idea. It is the grassroots Australians that are being forgotten. There has been very little case law on the meaning of the words public purpose, particularly in the context of the like cases of acquisition for the primary purpose of the land for the training of a foreign army. Irrespective of the wide ambit of the definition of the words public purpose within the Land Acquisitions Act of 1989, it is evident from case law that such an acquisition must be shown to be actually for the benefit of the public. The bill which I would seek to support of all parties, clarifies the meaning of those important words, public purpose. It is important for all Australians that they know their land and their heritage will never be compulsorily acquired for the benefit for an unrelated third party. And as far as I'm concerned, especially for a foreign third party. Before any declaration is made by any department to acquire an interest in land, the bill will require that department to demonstrate the purpose of using that interest or for its need for that interest to provide services. The acquiring authority must show that the need will be for the direct benefit of Australian public or for the provision of the Australian public of necessary services. The bill does not alter the intent of the original Act. It clarifies the meaning and intent of the Act so that the Australian public will never again be subject to months of upset and costs in trying to protect their interest for the ongoing benefits of their families. I hope both sides of this House, this chamber, and the minor political parties clearly look at what I'm putting forward here, if they truly want to represent the people of Australia. And if they saw the faces of these farming families and what was going to happen to them, they would understand. That could be our sons, our daughters, our brothers, our aunts, our families, our cousins. These people are looking to us for clearly standing up and fighting and representing them. It is not up to the bureaucrats to make the decisions. It is not up to these foreign interests to put in and say, we want this and we want that. It's up to us to make the right decisions on behalf of these people who are relying on us to fight for them and stand up for their rights. As I said to you earlier, I've got no problems with acquiring of land for the right reasons, because this country has grown rapidly. But when we are asking people to give up their land that they love and they've seen their families past fight for their right to freedom of their land and their way of life in this country, and we are prepared to allow it to be sold to a foreign power, a Singaporean army, so they can do their training, it's not good enough as far as I'm concerned. So all I'm asking in this bill is that if anyone's going to acquire land, make sure it is in the best interest for the Australian people, not a foreign power. Give the Australian people some stability and know that their decisions made is right for them and for future generations. It does overcome the vagueness of the existing definition, but gives clarity to the meaning of those two words, public purpose, without the need for future litigation. The bill does not apply to acquisitions by consent. And as I said to you, and I will say, due to One Nation and of fighting for this matter, and I know there were some others on the government side who who did disagree with the acquisition of the land, compulsory acquisition of the land for the Singaporean Army, and I do appreciate their support on this.
Senator Hanson, your time's expired.
Thank you.
Senator Osei.